September 1963, 0900 hours. A single M60 Patton sits on the western approach of a bridge over the Lahn River in central West Germany. The tank commander, a staff sergeant named Daly, has no idea where the rest of his platoon is. He took a left where the map said right, or the map said left where the road went right. The distinction stopped mattering about 40 minutes ago. What matters now is that his four-man crew just drove unopposed across a crossing point that NATO's own war planners had marked in red as a Soviet priority target, and that the opposing force referees trailing behind him in jeeps are losing their minds on the radio. This is the kind of story that never makes it into the official accounts. A wrong turn during Exercise Big Lift that accidentally proved a bridge could be seized by armor alone. No infantry screen, no engineer recon, no air cover. If you want the real Cold War stories, the ones too strange and too embarrassing for anyone to put on a recruitment poster, hit subscribe, drop a like. And if you served at Gießen or anywhere along the Fulda Gap in the 60s, leave a comment, because the Army's paperwork on this one has holes you could drive a Patton through. The Lahn River Bridge at Wetzlar sat in a peculiar tactical position, too far north for the main Fulda Gap corridor, too far south for the North German plain. Soviet operational planning, according to documents recovered after reunification from East German military archives, designated it a Category 3 crossing. That meant it rated demolition priority but low assault value. The terrain on the eastern approach funneled armor into a 400-meter bottleneck between a rail yard and a steep wooded ridge. Warsaw-packed planners ran tabletop exercises on the Wetzlar crossing at least twice between 1959 and 1962. Both times, the conclusion held firm. Armored seizure without dismounted infantry support carried an estimated failure rate above 80%. The road geometry killed it. One defending platoon with pre-registered mortar fires could hold that bottleneck for 6 to 8 hours, long enough for NATO engineers to wire the bridge and drop it into the river. So, how did a lost staff sergeant with 4 men and 1 tank do what the Soviets called impossible? The short answer involves fog, a livestock auction, and the fact that the opposing force company assigned to defend the bridge had pulled 2 of its 3 platoons off the position to deal with a simulated chemical strike 3 kilometers east. The longer answer is more interesting, because it touches on something the Army spent the next 2 years quietly studying: the difference between what wargaming says a position requires and what actually happens when a 52-ton vehicle appears where nobody expects one. Daly's M60 came out of the fog on the western road, not the eastern approach. He'd gotten so thoroughly lost that he crossed the river on a secondary agricultural bridge 2 kilometers south, a bridge rated for 12 tons that, by all engineering logic, should have collapsed under him, and approached the Wetzlar bridge from the defended side. The opposing force sentries saw an American tank coming from behind their own lines and assumed it belonged to the referees. Nobody fired a blank. Nobody radioed it in. Daly's driver pulled onto the bridge, stopped, and asked a West German farmer on a bicycle for directions to Gießen. The farmer pointed east. They drove across. The referees arrived 11 minutes later and ruled the bridge captured. The after-action report from Big Lift, filed by V Corps, lists the incident in a single paragraph on page 47. It uses the phrase unplanned exploitation of an undefended crossing, language so deliberately bland it almost hides the fact that a sergeant who couldn't read a map just invalidated 2 years of Soviet planning assumptions. The agricultural bridge he crossed first? Post-exercise inspection found both support beams cracked along their full length. The bridge held for 1 crossing. It would not have held for 2. The records don't say whether anyone told Daly how close he came to putting his crew in the river. Fulda, West Germany, 60 kilometers east of the Lahn. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment owned this stretch of border the way a rancher owns a fence line, riding it daily, fixing what broke, watching what moved on the other side. Their observation posts dotted the hilltops along the inter-German border from Bad Hersfeld south to Rasdorf. Each one manned around the clock. Binoculars pointed east. Logbooks filled with entries about Soviet patrol rotations, vehicle counts, antenna configurations, fence line repairs. The men who served there called it the edge. On a clear day, you could see East German border guards walking their dogs along the trace. On a bad day, you couldn't see 50 meters and you sat in a concrete bunker listening to ground sensors ping every time a deer crossed the tripwire. The 11th ACR ran this routine for decades. Wake up, drive to the border, watch, drive back, file the report, do it again tomorrow. The most dangerous thing most troopers encountered on a typical patrol rotation involved ice on the logging roads in January. But the unit existed for one scenario only. Soviet planners called it the Fulda Gap. For the same reason NATO did, geography left them no choice. The North German plain offered width but exposed flanks. The Hof corridor ran too far south. Fulda threaded the needle between the Vogelsberg Highlands and the Rhone Mountains, opening into the Rhine-Main plain with Frankfurt 65 kilometers beyond. 8 Soviet divisions from the 8th Guards Army sat in Thuringia, rehearsing this thrust twice a year. Their planning documents, recovered from the Stasi archives in 1991, referenced 47 specific river and stream crossings along the projected axis of advance. Each one received a classification. Category 1 meant seized intact by forward detachments at all costs. Category 2 meant bridging assets prepositioned within 4 hours. Category 3 meant destroy if NATO hasn't already. The Lahn crossings fell into Category 3. Soviet assessments called them, and this phrasing appears in a 1961 operational planning annex from the Group of Soviet Forces Germany, tactically redundant given successful exploitation of the Fulda and Schlitz river lines. Moscow's planners looked at the Lahn and saw a problem already solved by the time their tanks reached it. NATO would either be broken or withdrawing. The bridges would either stand undefended or lie in the river. Either way, the Lahn didn't rate assault planning. This assumption rested on a specific sequence of events unfolding exactly as war-gamed. The 8th Guards would punch through Fulda in under 72 hours. The 11th ACR would delay but not hold. NATO reinforcements from the United States, if they arrived at all, would need 10 to 14 days to reach combat strength in theater. Exercise Big Lift existed to test whether that timeline could be cut in half. The M13 ballistic computer inside an M60 Patton weighed 31 pounds and occupied a steel box bolted beneath the gunner's station. It accepted inputs for range, wind, ammunition type, barrel wear, and cant angle. It processed these variables through an analog circuit board and fed corrections to the fire control system. On paper, a marvel of early 60s engineering. In practice, the thing broke constantly. 13 years after Big Lift, a different exercise, different crew, same river. Autumn 1976, exercise, certain sentinel. NATO ran these things like clockwork every fall, armored units deployed from garrisons across West Germany into the countryside to rehearse defensive positions against a simulated Soviet advance. The scenario never changed much. Soviets pour through the gap. NATO trades space for time. Reinforcements arrive or they don't. What changed were the units rotating through, the weather, and the creative ways junior NCOs found to get lost in the Hessian hills. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski commanded Charlie 24, an M60A1 assigned to Charlie Troop, 3rd Squadron, 14th Armored Cavalry. His gunner, Specialist Reeves, had 9 months in country. His loader, Private First Class Dominguez, had 4. His driver, a corporal named Teague, had been in Germany long enough to know every back road between Gießen and Bad Nauheim, but apparently not the ones south of Wetzlar. Kowalski's crew had a reputation inside the squadron for gunnery scores that shouldn't have been possible given the state of their fire control system. Charlie 24's M13 computer had failed its last 3 maintenance checks. The analog potentiometers drifted. Range inputs above 2,000 meters produced corrections that put rounds consistently left by 4 to 6 mils. Squadron maintenance kept ordering replacement circuit boards from Depot. Depot kept shipping the wrong variant, so Reeves stopped using it. A brief detour here, because what happened at Wetzlar only makes sense if you understand what shooting an M60 without a ballistic computer actually required. The gunner had to estimate range visually or by stadia lines in the reticle, counting how many mils a target occupied and running the math backward to get distance. Then he manually indexed the range on his super elevation knob, dialed wind correction by feel, and fired. A trained crew with a working computer could put a first-round hit on a tank-sized target at 1,500 meters roughly 70% of the time. Without the computer, that number dropped to around 40% for most gunners. Reeves, according to his crew qualification scores from July 1976, hit 83% at 1,500 meters with the M13 powered off. His squadron commander's assessment, preserved in Reeves's service record, called his manual gunnery instinctive rather than calculated. The distinction matters. A gunner who calculates needs time. A gunner who feels the shot needs a target. Back to the exercise. October 14th, 0730. Fog across the Lahn Valley so thick Teague drove with his hatch open, head out, navigating by road signs he could barely read. Charlie Troop's 4 tanks had orders to proceed south from Gießen to occupy a blocking position along Highway 457 near the village of Atzbach. Kowalski's platoon leader, a second lieutenant on his first field exercise, transmitted a grid coordinate for the rally point. The coordinate contained a transposition error. 2 digits swapped. Instead of directing the platoon southeast toward Atzbach, it pointed them due south toward the river. Kowalski's platoon leader and the other 2 tanks in the platoon caught the mistake after 6 kilometers when the terrain stopped matching the map. They corrected course. Charlie 2-4, running trail by 300 meters, missed the radio call. Teague had dropped back to avoid the dust, or in this case, the mud spray, from the tank ahead. By the time Kowalski realized he couldn't see the rest of the platoon, the fog had swallowed everything except the road directly beneath his tracks. They were heading straight for Wetzlar. Kowalski's after-action testimony to the Squadron S3 uses 11 words to describe the moment Charlie 2-4 broke through the fog line above the Lahn Valley. I saw the bridge, and I knew nobody was on it. 11 words. No mention of the cold, and it ran about 4 degrees Celsius that morning according to weather logs from Gießen Airfield. No mention of the river below, running high and brown from 3 days of rain. No mention of Dominguez asking on the intercom whether they should turn around. Just the bridge. Just the absence of defenders. 0814. Kowalski ordered Teague to stop on the western approach road, 50 meters from the span. He scanned through his cupola vision blocks. The opposing force unit assigned to hold the Wetzlar crossing during certain sentinel, a platoon from the 1st Battalion, 36th Infantry, had positioned 2 M113s on the eastern bank and strung concertina wire across the road. Standard defensive posture for a Category 3 crossing. Except both tracks sat empty. Hatches open. No movement. The wire gate across the road hung loose on one post. Kowalski keyed the radio. Nothing from his platoon leader. Nothing from Charlie Troop's command net. The fog ate transmissions in the Lahn Valley. Something about the terrain and the river moisture created a dead zone that signals troops had documented repeatedly and never fixed. He tried twice more. Static. So, what do you do when you're a staff sergeant with a broken radio, a broken fire control computer, and a bridge that Soviet war planners spent 3 years calling unseizable, sitting wide open in front of you? You take the bridge. 0819. Teague rolled Charlie 2-4 across the span at walking speed, 5 kilometers per hour, tracks grinding on wet asphalt. Kowalski traversed the turret right, then left, scanning the tree line on the eastern bank. Reeves had his eye pressed to the gunner's sight, super elevation cranked to 800 meters, finger resting above the trigger guard. They crossed in under 90 seconds. Kowalski positioned the tank hull down behind the eastern M113 and pointed the main gun back across the river. They held for 38 minutes. During that time, Dominguez loaded and unloaded the main gun twice on Kowalski's orders as shapes moved in the fog along the far bank, both times civilian vehicles. Teague kept the engine running. The vibration traveled through the hull floor, up through the seats, into the base of every spine. Reeves never took his eye off the sight. The infantry platoon soldiers returned from a breakfast run at 0857, carrying actual food from an actual guest house 400 meters up the road. They found an American tank sitting in their position, engine idling, gun pointed at them. 4 radio calls in 11 minutes. That's how long it took for the Wetzlar incident to climb from a confused infantry lieutenant standing in front of a tank that shouldn't have been there to the V Corps exercise control cell in Frankfurt. The first call went from the infantry platoon leader to his company commander at 0902. He reported an unidentified M60A1 occupying his defensive position and refusing to move. The company commander asked if the crew belonged to the opposing force element. The lieutenant said no. The tank commander claimed to be from the 14th ACR and insisted the bridge defense had been compromised. The company commander told the lieutenant to sort it out locally. The lieutenant called back 4 minutes later. The tank commander, Kowalski, had shown him the empty M113s, the loose concertina wire, the unmanned observation post on the western bank. The lieutenant's own soldiers confirmed they'd left the position unattended for approximately 43 minutes to get breakfast. The company commander stopped telling people to sort it out locally. Third call. Battalion S3 to Brigade. The word penetration appeared for the first time. An armored vehicle had crossed a defended river obstacle without opposition during a live exercise, simulating Soviet westward advance. The fact that it moved east to west rather than west to east didn't matter. The bridge fell. The direction was irrelevant to the failure. Fourth call. Brigade to V Corps exercise control. 0913. The senior exercise evaluator, a full colonel named Hessler, pulled the Wetzlar crossing up on his situation map and found exactly what Soviet planners in Thuringia would have found. A Category 3 crossing marked as defended, covered, and wired for demolition. None of those things had been true at 0819 that morning. Hessler paused the exercise across the entire southern sector at 0922. Look at what actually happened in that pause. 17 units across 3 brigades received hold-in-place orders. Convoy movements on 4 federal highways stopped. German police had to redirect civilian traffic around frozen military columns for 6 hours. The Bundeswehr liaison to V Corps called it, according to the exercise log, an embarrassment of considerable proportion. Hessler's evaluation team descended on Wetzlar by helicopter before noon. What they found made the breakfast run look minor. The demolition charges on the Wetzlar Bridge, simulated, obviously, but representing real pre-positioned munitions in the wartime plan, had not been connected to their firing circuit. The detonation authority chain required confirmation from battalion, which required confirmation from brigade, which required a release code from V Corps. The bridge crew didn't have the code, and battalion had never verified one existed in their safe. The entire demolition sequence, if tested against a real Soviet crossing attempt, contained a 90-minute gap between authorization request and earliest possible detonation. A T-62 at road march speed covers 27 kilometers in 90 minutes. Kowalski's crew sat on Charlie 2-4 through all of this, engines still running, Teague's hands still on the laterals. The evaluators interviewed each crew member separately in the back of an M577 command track. Dominguez remembered the smell. Diesel exhaust mixing with wet canvas and the coffee someone handed him that had already gone cold. Reeves answered every question in 5 words or fewer. The evaluator's transcript runs 14 pages for Kowalski, 3 for Reeves. One detail from the evaluation report sits disconnected from everything else. The bridge's load rating had been reassessed in 1974 and downgraded from military load class 60 to class 50. Charlie 2-4, combat loaded, weighed 52 tons. The bridge should not have held. The report notes this fact in a single line and never returns to it. Hessler's final assessment went to USAREUR headquarters in Heidelberg on November 3, 1976. The word he used for the Wetzlar Bridge defense, and for 7 other Category 3 crossings evaluated during certain Sentinel, landed hard enough to trigger a complete review of NATO River crossing denial procedures across the entire Central European theater. The word was indefensible. Hessler's review team spent 11 days at Wetzlar after the exercise ended. They tested every bridge in the southern sector, 14 crossings total. 9 failed at least one criterion for defensibility. 3 had demolition authorization chains that ran through offices staffed only during business hours. The report landed on desks in Heidelberg, Brussels, and Washington before Christmas. USAREUR Directive 77-03, published February 19, 1977, restructured river crossing denial authority for all Category 3 and above bridges in the Central European theater. Demolition release codes moved from corps-level safes to battalion. Bridge guard force minimums doubled. Mandatory 24-hour manning requirements replaced the informal rotation schedules that had let an entire infantry platoon walk to a guest house for eggs and bread. The directive cited Exercise Certain Sentinel 17 times. It cited the Wetzlar crossing by name in 4 of its 6 appendices. Kowalski received a letter of commendation from the squadron commander. Reeves, Dominguez, and Teague received nothing. The infantry platoon leader at Wetzlar received a formal letter of reprimand. His company commander received one, too. Sources conflict on whether either remained in the Army past 1978. The story could have ended there. 23 years later, a researcher at the National Security Archive at George Washington University found a reference to the Wetzlar Bridge in a collection of translated Soviet General Staff documents declassified after reunification. The reference appeared in a 1979 revision to the 3rd Shock Army's Operational Planning Annex for the Western Axis of Advance through Hesse. The Lahn River crossing at Wetzlar, previously assessed as a secondary objective requiring 1 reinforced motor rifle battalion to seize, had been upgraded. The revision called for a full regiment with dedicated engineer support and pre-positioned bridging equipment. The planning timeline for securing the crossing dropped from 6 hours to 90 minutes. The document's margin notation, translated from Russian, identified the catalyst for reassessment as intelligence indicating NATO reinforcement of Lahn Valley Bridge defenses in early 1977. The Soviets noticed. They didn't know why NATO suddenly cared about Wetzlar. They just knew the posture changed, and they adjusted. A lost tank crew's wrong turn forced Moscow to commit an additional 1,500 troops and 40 vehicles to a single river crossing in every subsequent war plan for the European theater. That allocation had to come from somewhere. The planning annex shows it came from the reserve echelon designated for exploitation past the Rhine. Kowalski left the Army in 1981 as a sergeant first class. He settled outside Fort Knox. Reeves re-enlisted twice and made staff sergeant before separating in 1984. Dominguez served 3 years and went home to Tucson. Teague stayed in armor, transferred to the 1st Cavalry Division, and retired as a master sergeant in 1994. The USAREUR evaluation of exercise. Certain Sentinel was classified confidential, downgraded to for official use only in 1989, and fully declassified in 1997. It occupies Box 14 of Record Group 550, Entry P44, at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland. The Wetzlar Bridge incident begins on page 87, the Soviet Planning Annex referencing the crossing sites in the Cold War International History Project Digital Archive, document number CWIHP-SR-79-0-4-17. 4 men, 1 broken computer, 43 unmanned minutes, 1,500 Soviet troops redirected for the rest of the Cold War.